want to move now to, okay, we've got that vague definition. I think we agree it's vague. But we're identifying kids. I mean, for 30 whatever years, we've been identifying since IDEA or 94-142 was passed. And most people agree those kids need services. You don't hear a lot of people saying, I don't know why this kid was identified. There's nothing wrong with him. I mean, most of the kids I've worked with who are identified with an emotional and behavioral disorder really have an emotional and behavioral disorder. And the question is usually, why didn't you identify this 4 years ago? I mean, that's honestly the question that I think is more pressing for us. So we're identifying kids. Well, how many and who are we identifying? These are just some of the facts and figures we've gleaned over the years. Researchers are continuing to look at this, and these are just some estimates. U.S. Surgeon General, a report almost 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago now, 5% of children and youth have serious mental health needs. Now, they sort of identified mental health needs more broadly, but think about the definition we're working from. Those are indicators of mental health needs. Let's face it. By the way, I don't think I have it here, but they also concluded that only about 1 in 5 was receiving any sort of services for their mental health needs, whether that's school-based or outside of school. The rates of conduct disorder. Now that's a DSM-4 or DSM, soon to be DSM-5 category of a psychiatric disorder, but conduct disorder is one of the major indicators of EBD. Conduct disorder is that acting out, externalizing behavior. Look at the numbers on here from pretty significant, this is 2 different studies that were pretty detailed, pretty elaborate, pretty comprehensive in assessing the prevalence nationwide of conduct disorder in school-age children. 6 to 16% of boys, 2 to 9% of girls were identified with conduct disorder. Okay, just keep those figures in mind. And you can average those. It's 2 different studies and depending on the sample, but you can sort of 6 to 16%, well, choose the mid-range there and say whatever that is, 10, 11%, 2 to 9%, 5, 6% of girls. It does occur less frequently in girls. We know that's true. EBD identification generally is whoppingly a male category. I don't know the final figures. I want to say 80%, but it varies from state to state and district to district. Another broad study looking at specific diagnosed disorders, 11.3%, a nationally representative sample. That study's cited quite a lot for the representativeness of their sample, meaning it was a pretty trustworthy study. But look at that number, 11.3%. Met some category under DSM, whether it's conduct disorder or, well, the majority would have been conduct disorder, but it could have been depression or other disorders as well. Out of 3,000, so again, a good and representative sample. So I give credit to Kaufman, but that is me, sort of concluded in looking at all these studies that the true prevalence of what we think of as EBD is probably in the 3 to 6% range. Our conclusion, and that's not just ours, others have made that same general conclusion, Forness has written a lot about this, have concluded that there's probably 3 to 6% of students at any given time that probably are displaying the level of behavioral need that warrants special education eligibility and services. Probably 3 to 6%. I happen to think that's even pretty conservative. Forness has argued that that changes over time, not from week to week, but a child might have a serious problem through elementary school. It might diminish in middle school, but you know what? Other kids are going to pick up the pace and join the group during middle school. So if you do this cumulative prevalence, it's probably even higher than that over time. But 3 to 6%, again, I think is a pretty conservative estimate. Now, what does that mean? Well, again, we're trying to figure out who we're identifying and why we're identifying them. How many are identified as having EBD in schools? How many students are we identifying? Do you happen to know where you work what the rates are like? I threw some numbers together here. It's hard to get a firm handle on this. If you talk nationwide, that's always difficult because break it down by state and you see some variation, and then by district within state and even more variation. but generally speaking, we've never identified more than about 1% of the school-aged population as having EBD. So that's my first point. We've just said conservatively 3 to 6% of our kids probably have those needs that warrant special ed. We've never identified as many as 1%. So we're already under by at least a factor of 3 and as much as a factor of 6. So just let that roll around for a second. In your school, if you find, those 2 women right there have EBD and they're identified and they're getting services, could you pick out 3 more kids who probably need services? I always could when I was in school. I could always say, boy, this guy over here, he's in such deep trouble, but they're not identifying him. Another point that you sort of alluded to, these numbers are often misleading. I grabbed this off a recent report. I don't have the year here. Well, the data is fall 2011. This is students aged 6 to 21, and so these numbers look a little lower. A lot of the data that are reported are school-age children, so it's this 6 to 17 category because kids tend to leave school at 17, even though they're technically still eligible for services through age 21. So the numbers look different. Nationally, this figure for school-age kids is up around 13%. Is that correct? Nationally. So both of these figures could be bumped up, but I put these up just to mirror or show that Indiana tends to mirror the national rates. And I threw up some other categories just to give you context. Learning disabilities continues to be the largest category, speech language, intellectual disabilities, and then emotional disturbance at the end. The point still being we're under 1% of the population is identified. Now, I'm not going to argue either way, or maybe I've already subtly argued it by saying the national estimates are 3 to 6%. If we're under 1%, we still have the same question, who are those 1%? And if we carve out, let's say you accept my 3 to 6% argument, who are the 2 to 5% that are not getting identified? Now, we've just said a lot of those are probably getting either some sort of tiered interventions, PBS, school-wide, level, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 interventions even, without being identified for special ed. That's a great thing. That's a positive step. That didn't exist when I was a teacher. I mean, it just flat out did not exist. So those kids really were getting nothing. They were getting suspensions and expulsions or in-school suspensions and on and on and on. That's all they got.